By the time the state admitted anything had gone wrong, generations of men had already worked themselves into the ground, and the profits were still being counted. The place was called Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola, but for most of its existence, it functioned less like a prison and more like a plantation that never closed. What made this different was not just the labor itself, but the fact that it continued, openly and legally, long after the rest of the country claimed it had moved on. That contradiction sits at the center of Angola's forced labor legacy, and it raises a question that has never fully gone away. How did a system that looked so much like slavery survive, in plain sight, into the modern American prison era? Angola sits on roughly 18,000 acres of land, bordered on three sides by the Mississippi River. Escape was never realistic. Isolation did most of the work. But long before it became a prison, this land was something else entirely. It was a plantation complex, worked by enslaved Africans, producing cotton, sugarcane, and later other crops that depended on mass labor and total control. When the Civil War ended, slavery was abolished in name, but not in practice. The exception clause of the 13th Amendment allowed involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime. That single line reshaped the South's labor system almost overnight. States like Louisiana began arresting large numbers of black men for minor or fabricated offenses, then leasing them out for labor. Angola emerged directly from that system. The land was purchased by the state in 1901, but the labor model barely changed. Prisoners replaced enslaved workers. Overseers replaced slave drivers. The field stayed the same. What followed shocked even people familiar with Southern prison history. For decades, Angola operated as a working farm on a scale unmatched by any other prison in the United States. Inmates planted and harvested crops by hand. They worked in cotton fields under armed guards on horseback. They labored from sunup to sundown, often with minimal pay or none at all. Discipline was enforced physically, sometimes brutally. This was not hidden. It was not secret. State officials defended it as efficient and necessary. The prison fed itself. It turned a profit. And for Louisiana, that mattered more than the human cost. But the question few outside ever learned to ask was how many men didn't survive the system long enough to leave. Early records from the prison show staggering death rates. Disease, exhaustion, violence, and neglect were common. Medical care was minimal. Housing was overcrowded. Men were worked regardless of physical condition. If someone collapsed, another person took his place. That wasn't the worst part. The racial imbalance at Angola mirrored the racial imbalance of the broader criminal justice system in the Deep South. The vast majority of the prison population was black. Most of the guards and administrators were white. In practice, the hierarchy of the old plantation system never disappeared. It was simply legalized. Angola's nickname, the farm, wasn't metaphorical. Inmates were assigned to work crews. They were expected to meet quotas. Refusal to work could lead to punishment, including solitary confinement, loss of privileges, or physical force, especially in earlier decades. And there was no realistic path out. Parole was rare. Many inmates were serving life sentences, often for crimes committed under questionable legal circumstances, particularly during the Jim Crow era. Angola became a place where men entered young and grew old in the fields. Few people outside ever learned what happened next. By the mid-20th century, Angola was widely considered one of the most violent prisons in America. Guards often turned a blind eye to inmate-on-inmate violence. In some cases, certain inmates were empowered as enforcers, controlling others through fear. The labor system continued alongside this chaos, as if productivity mattered more than safety. The state's response was not reform, but containment. Violence was treated as an internal problem. Deaths were normalized. The prison remained largely closed to outside scrutiny. That began to change in the 1960s and 1970s, when civil rights lawsuits started to reach federal courts. Inmates challenged conditions at Angola, arguing that forced labor, physical abuse, and denial of medical care violated constitutional protections. What followed forced Louisiana to defend a system it had never seriously questioned. Federal judges toured the prison. They reviewed evidence. They heard testimony from inmates who described being worked at gunpoint, beaten for refusing labor, and denied basic human dignity. The comparisons to slavery were not subtle. In some rulings, judges explicitly referenced the plantation origins of the prison. But even then, the core labor system survived. Angola made changes on paper. Overt physical abuse decreased. Some oversight was introduced. Pay rates were technically established, though they remained extremely low. Yet inmates were still required to work. Refusal was still punishable. And the prison still relied on inmate labor to function. That contradiction remains unresolved. Today, Angola continues to operate as a massive agricultural prison. Inmates grow crops, raise livestock, and perform maintenance across the property. The work is framed as rehabilitation, job training, and structure. Supporters argue that it provides purpose and reduces idleness. Critics see something else entirely. They point out that most inmates earn pennies per hour. That participation is not truly voluntary. That refusal can still affect housing, privileges, and parole prospects. And that the racial makeup of the prison population remains disproportionately black, echoing the same patterns established over a century ago. But that isn't the only tension. Angola has also become known for its hospice program, its religious initiatives, and its attempt to rebrand itself as a place of reform rather than punishment. These programs are real, and for some inmates, they are meaningful. Yet they exist alongside a labor system rooted in the prison's plantation past. The contradiction is impossible to ignore. One moment, Angola is presented as a model of rehabilitation. The next, it is defended as an institution where forced labor is necessary to maintain order and self-sufficiency. Both claims cannot fully exist without raising uncomfortable questions. And that's where the story turns. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. The legal justification for prison labor has never disappeared. The same constitutional exception that allowed Angola to operate as it did in the early 1900s still exists today. Courts have repeatedly ruled that incarcerated people can be required to work, even without pay, as part of their sentence. That legal reality shapes everything. Attempts to challenge prison labor as modern slavery have largely failed in court. Judges acknowledge the historical parallels but defer to constitutional language. The result is a system that many consider morally indefensible, yet legally protected. Angola is not unique in this respect. But its scale, history, and visibility make it impossible to dismiss as an outlier. The prison still hosts rodeos, where inmates perform for paying crowds. The events are promoted as entertainment and tradition. Supporters say they humanize inmates and raise money for programs. Critics argue they reduce incarcerated people to spectacle, reinforcing power dynamics rooted in the prison's past. And still, the fields remain. Men in uniform move in lines across land once worked by enslaved laborers. Guards watch from a distance. The crops are harvested. The prison remains operationally self-sufficient in ways few others are. The unresolved question is not whether Angola has changed. It has, in measurable ways. The question is whether change is possible without confronting the foundation it was built on. For many inmates, Angola is not a temporary sentence. It is a place they will never leave. Life without parole is common. Aging inmates work as long as their bodies allow. When they can no longer work, they are moved to other duties or to hospice care. The system does not end. It simply slows down. Outside the prison, debates about mass incarceration, racial disparity, and prison labor continue. Angola is often cited, sometimes defensively, sometimes critically. But rarely is it confronted as a direct continuation of a system the country claims to have abolished. That discomfort may be the reason the story never fully settles. Angola stands today as both a functioning modern prison and a living artifact of America's unresolved past. It is neither entirely one nor the other. and that ambiguity is what keeps the controversy alive. Because as long as forced labor remains legal inside prison walls, the line between punishment and exploitation will remain dangerously thin. And Angola, more than almost any other prison in the United States, sits directly on that line. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.